One of the questions most people want to know is, how reliable is the Bible? Well, the manuscript evidence is one of the ways that we can determine how accurate and reliable the Bible really is. And today, that's what we're going to look at, manuscript evidence, and we'll do it right now. All right, thanks for watching. My name is Steve Huff with Reasons Matter, and I'm excited to talk to you today about manuscript evidence. And when you talk about manuscript evidence, there's something I should tell you right from the start. Manuscripts are not the original writings. Before the days of the printing press and being able to do mass-produced printed copies, everything was written by hand. And when an author originally wrote something, that was called an autograph. Now, in Bible times, they were writing on material like papyrus. It was not very durable. It didn't last very long, and so it was essential that they make copies, and lots of them, in order to preserve and to share with others these important writings. And so the originals are called autographs, but all of the copies are called manuscripts. And so here's the question. We talked about this. What is manuscript evidence? It's all of the copies that exist of an original document that, in this case, when it comes to the Bible, we don't have. And so the reason we want to look at manuscript evidence and how reliable or helpful it is because when we can have confidence in those manuscripts, then that gives us some sense of security or confidence that what we do have is close to or very identical with the original writings. That's all it is. And so there are a couple of factors that make manuscript evidence reliable. I think one obvious one you might have thought of already is the number of copies, right? If we had just one copy, one ancient copy of the Bible, but it wasn't the original, we might say to ourselves, how reliable is that? Have there been any changes? How would we know? But of course, if we have lots of copies, we can compare and contrast those, especially if by dating those copies, we can see how the text, if it changed over time. And of course, if there's a copy that goes back very close to the original writings, and then 100 years later we have some copies and there are some changes to them, guess what? As a general rule, we would assume that the older copy is the more reliable, and the one that's different 100 years later has been altered either on purpose or by accident. And so the more copies you have, the better the chance that you can reconstruct and have confidence that what we've got is identical or very close to or accurately matches the original. So the number of copies is a big deal. And the other really big deal is how close those oldest copies are to the original. Obviously, if there's a long period of time between the original and the oldest known copy, it raises questions of what might have happened in between that time. Obviously, not only are the originals lost, but a lot of intervening copies are lost, and how are we to know if it's a long period of time? So the closer the manuscripts are back to the original, and the number of them, even over time, can really help us zero in on the accuracy of an ancient document. Well, I want to show you some examples. Take a look at this. We're going to look at some works by different authors. We're going to look at the period of time in which those were written, and then we'll see what are the earliest known copies of those documents. Well, that'll give us an idea of the time span between when they were written and the earliest known copies. And of course, we want to see the number of copies for each of those works as well. So let me get right to it. We have writings from Caesar, a couple of them. I think he's recounting some of the battles or wars that he was involved in. And I'm sorry, this cat is jumping all over me. He wrote between a period of 100 BC and 44 BC. And the earliest copies we have date back to AD 900. That means there was a 1,000-year period of time between when Caesar wrote his autographs and the earliest known manuscripts that we have. And you can see here, there are 10 known copies of Caesar's work. So, okay, we look at that, we study the works of Caesar in school, and we go, okay, look, what we have is 1,000 years after he originally wrote, and we have 10 copies to look at. Here's another example, Plato. You can't go to college today without being exposed to some of Plato's writings. Well, Plato was written, as you can see in that period, in the 4th and 5th century BC. Again, the oldest copies we have of Plato are from AD 900. So there's a 1,200-year span of time. And what do we have? 7 copies of Plato. What do you think happened between the time Plato wrote those and 1,200 years later, the oldest copies we have? But what do you think happened? In point of fact, we don't really know. And there are only 7 copies. But let me ask you a question. Let me ask you this, because this is important. Did you ever, in your studies of Plato or Caesar or these other works I'm going to show you in school, did anybody ever say, hey, what you're reading may not have been Plato's work? Did that ever happen? No, it didn't, because look, these are big time spans and they're not very many copies, but the general consensus is we're reading Caesar's work. We're reading Plato's work. Nobody really questions that. Here's another one. Everybody knows the name Aristotle. You've probably in school read some of his works. You're talking about an 1100-year, AD 1100 is the oldest copies we have in a time span of 1400 years. But we do have 49 copies. And so with those 49 copies, we can, the oldest going back to 1400 years after the original, at least we can look at, are there changes among those 49? And that'll give us maybe some idea of how much attention to detail the copyists made in the writing. I mean, you know, it's a long time span. How are we supposed to know if what we're reading is really the work of Aristotle? Now, before I go on to the next one, let me tell you something, that these numbers here, 1,000 years, 1,200 years, 1,400 years, 10 copies, 7 copies, these are pretty typical of historical documents. Then you get to Sophocles. Sophocles, it's really pretty unusual. Not in the time span between the original writing and our earliest known copies, that's still 1,000 years. But to have 193 copies, that's really out of the norm. Typically what you'll find, if I could show you a bunch of other ones, I won't, but you know, they're 10 years and they're 7 years and they're 12 years and they're 14 years. Excuse me, not years, but copies. 10 and 7 and 4. It's just not a lot. There's not a lot there. And they span long periods of time, just like we're seeing here. But Sophocles, at least, you know, there's 193. Sophocles is an outlier, and I'm going to show you one more outlier, because I don't want to be accused of just cherry picking what I'm showing you. We've all heard of Homer, his work, the Iliad. Many of you probably read it. This is pretty remarkable as far as ancient documents go, because the earliest known copies date back to 400 BC, and Homer was written in 900 BC. That means there's only a 500-year gap between the autographs and the oldest or earliest known copies. And there are 643 copies of Homer's Iliad. Now, again, 500 years, still a long time. We don't know what could have happened in the copying process between the original and the 500 years, but at least there's a lot of copies that we can look at, right? So this is what it's like with ancient documents. You want to talk about manuscript evidence. This is what you can expect. Typically 10 years, 7, 12, 14, this type of thing. Sophocles is an outlier at 193 copies. Homer is really an outlier because there's 643 copies, and it goes back to within 500 years of when they were originally written. Now, here's the big deal. Let's look at the New Testament. The New Testament writers. So, first of all, the events of the life of Jesus took place around 30 to 33 AD. That was when Jesus was thought to have been crucified and resurrected, around AD 33. The first writings began to take place around AD 40. within a few years, as they told these accounts and shared them, the eyewitnesses told about what happened, they began to write them down. And as the church spread throughout the known world in the first century, it was by the end of the first century, by AD 90 or 100 maybe, that the last parts of the New Testament were written. Now, the earliest known copies that we have go back to AD 125. Do you know what that means? That means that the time span between when they were written by hand by the original writers and the copies we have spans only 25 years. And this is hugely significant because in those 25 years, the eyewitnesses, many of them, would have still been alive. The people who heard the first-hand accounts from the eyewitnesses would have still been alive. So if I were making copies 25 years after, in AD 125, and I started making up stuff or changing what was said or embellishing on it or those kinds of things, there would have been enough eyewitnesses around to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not how it really happened. So the fact that our earliest known copies go back so close to the original writings gives us great confidence that the copies we have are in line with the original. Now, not only do the earliest copies go back so close to the original, but let's look at the number of copies. Now, I said that Homer's writings are kind of an outlier because there are over 600 copies to exist. Would it be impressive if we could say the same about the New Testament, that there were at least, how about if I told you that there were more than double, like 1,300 copies, twice what there is of Homer's writings? That'd be pretty impressive, wouldn't it? What if I told you that we had like 10 times as many copies as we do of Homer's Iliads, like, up in the 6,000 range? That'd be pretty impressive. Friends, we have more than 40 times the number of the copies that there are of Iliad, more than 24,000 copies of books or parts of books or other aspects of the New Testament that we can put together. They go back, not all of them obviously, but some of them go back to as early as just 25 years after the original writings. And then there are copies up through the centuries that follow. And we have not only copies in the original language, but we have early translations into other copies. And it's really remarkable because when you want to look at any possible changes or variations that occur in the text, and let's be clear, there are many, 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 many variations as you read these copies and these documents. But of all the variations, we'll talk about this more in another lesson, but of all of those variations, we can piece together where those variations happen in the chain of copying and go back to those earliest documents, and we can have a confidence in almost 99% of the words that make up the New Testament. And of the very few variants that we're not entirely sure about, none of those affect any doctrine, any theology, any part of the core belief system of the Christian faith. And even among those, we're pretty certain of what the original was. But again, it's just a matter of honesty and integrity. We say there's this tiny little part, doesn't affect any real meanings or understandings or doctrines of the Bible. But when you have 24,000 copies and they go back that close to the original writing, let me tell you something. That is like no other ancient document of any kind, religious, secular, or otherwise. There is absolutely nothing that compares to that. So when it comes to the manuscript evidence, let me just tell you, we can have great confidence in the reliability of the Bible. We're going to have more about this in other lessons. I'm glad you tuned in and watched, and I want to thank you very much. What are you still watching for? The video's over. I get it. You're just interested in more content. In that case, I want to invite you to subscribe, click like, and even click the bell icon so that you'll be notified every time we paste more content. Once again, I'm Steve Huff, and I want to thank you for watching today's show. Take care.